Picture yourself at 25. Maybe you showed up to that wedding with a gift but forgot the card. Or perhaps you brought a card but no present. Or maybe you didn't go at all. These small moments, these tiny social missteps that seem insignificant, can actually reveal something profound about how we learn to connect with others. There's a phenomenon sweeping across the modern world, touching lives in every corner of the globe. It's the story of the person who looks back at their teenage years and wonders what happened to all those possibilities that seemed so endless. They remember having friends in elementary school, being invited to birthday celebrations, passing their classes without drama. Somewhere along the line, something shifted. Not dramatically, not all at once, gradually, like a plane that builds momentum on the runway, lifts its front wheels, but somehow never quite achieves flight. This isn't just happening in one place. In different languages and cultures, people have created specific terms to describe this experience. In certain parts of Asia, there's a concept about withdrawing from society entirely. In parts of Latin America and Southern Europe, young people are described with phrases that translate to neither studying nor working. In English-speaking countries, we use acronyms to describe those not in employment, education, or training. Each culture has recognized the same pattern and given it a name, which tells us something crucial. This isn't an individual failure. This is a structural shift in how human society functions. The pattern looks like this. Someone grows up doing reasonably well. They have acquaintances, they attend school, they participate in the basic rhythms of social life. But as the years progress, the distance between them and their peers grows wider. Not because of any single traumatic event. That would almost be easier to understand and address. Instead, it's a gradual drifting, a slow accumulation of small disconnections. The friend who goes to a different college and somehow makes new connections while you don't. The social invitations that slowly decrease in frequency. The sense that everyone else received a manual for adult life that somehow never made it to your mailbox. Makes this particularly painful is the absence of a clear cause to point to. There's no obvious trauma, no dramatic turning point. When someone struggles because of abuse or tragedy, society understands and offers sympathy. When the struggle comes 1,000 small absences rather than one big presence, people, including the person experiencing it, often conclude that it must be a personal failing. After all, if others are managing fine under similar circumstances, doesn't that mean the problem is internal? This is where a particularly toxic word enters the picture, the idea of being a person who fails at life's basic challenges. We've had this concept for generations, and when someone starts to identify with it, or worse, when others begin to apply it to them, it carries a brutal implication. It suggests that the situation is entirely their fault, that they're simply not trying hard enough, that they lack some fundamental quality that functional adults possess. But here's what years of working with people in this situation has revealed: this framing is fundamentally wrong. It's not that these individuals are failing at something others are succeeding at. It's that the entire landscape of human connection has shifted beneath everyone's feet, and some people happen to be standing in places where they felt the earthquake more intensely. Think about how human beings learned social skills for thousands of years. You grew up in a community where you saw the same faces daily. You watched adults interact You played with the same children year after year. You attended the same gatherings with the same people. Social skills weren't something you were explicitly taught. They were absorbed through constant, repetitive exposure. The village, the neighborhood, the stable community provided an automatic training ground. Now consider what's changed. Communities are no longer geographically stable. People move frequently for work, for education, for opportunity. The internet has created the possibility of connection without physical presence, but it's also created isolation within physical spaces. Parents who themselves learned social skills through immersion in stable communities don't necessarily know how to explicitly teach these skills because they were never explicitly taught themselves. They absorb them naturally from an environment that no longer exists in the same way. This creates a specific type of challenge. Imagine someone's grandmother describing her childhood village, a place where for 300 years, not a single person had ever traveled to another country, where the idea of other nations was almost theoretical. A child seeing an airplane for the first time asked how you avoid falling out because the only transportation they'd ever known was an ox pulling a cart. In that world, you didn't need to be taught how to maintain relationships. Everyone stayed in the same place, saw each other constantly, and social bonds were reinforced through sheer proximity and repetition. Contrast that with the modern experience. People work remotely. They move cities for jobs. They communicate through screens. The automatic social training ground has been replaced by what exactly? Many parents don't realize their children need explicit instruction in maintaining relationships because they themselves never needed that instruction. The environment did the teaching for them. This is where the concept of circumstance becomes crucial. Every person is born into a particular time, a particular place, with particular parents who have particular knowledge and blind spots. You don't choose when you're born. You don't choose who raises you. You don't choose whether your parents understand that in the modern world, children need explicit teaching in skills that previous generations absorbed automatically. Consider the simple act of attending a birthday celebration as a child. Did your parents help you select a present? Did they involve you in writing a card? Did they coach you on handing both the gift and card to your friend, even though it might feel awkward? Did they explain why these gestures matter, how they build and maintain friendships? Or did they handle everything themselves, send you empty-handed, not realizing they were missing an opportunity to teach relationship maintenance? When the celebration was yours, did your parents have you hand out small thank you gifts to each guest? Did they make you express gratitude to each person for coming? These might seem like small courtesies, even old-fashioned ones, but they're actually lessons in reciprocity, in acknowledging others, in the give and take that sustains relationships over time. Or consider conflict with peers. When you had a falling out with another child, parent intervene, not to solve the problem for you, but to coach you through solving it yourself. Did they help you navigate the uncomfortable conversation, the apology, the reconciliation? Or were you left to figure it out alone, perhaps avoiding the conflict entirely and learning that relationships are disposable rather than worth repairing? Some people received this coaching. Others didn't. And the ones who didn't aren't defective. They simply weren't taught. But here's the cruel part. When you reach 20, 5 and struggle to maintain friendships, the world doesn't ask whether you were taught these skills. The world, and you yourself, assumes you should just know. And when you don't, the conclusion seems obvious. You must be fundamentally flawed. This is the trap of accepting responsibility for things you cannot control. Yes, you're responsible for your own actions now, but you're not responsible for the teaching you didn't receive. The era you were born into, technology reshaped human connection during your formative years. When you blur this distinction, when you accept blame for systemic factors beyond your control, you set yourself up for an impossible task. You're trying to fix something while misunderstanding what's actually broken. Understanding this distinction between what you're responsible for and what you're not is liberating. It doesn't mean giving up or making excuses. It means directing your energy toward things you can actually change rather than berating yourself for things that were never in your control. But here's where people often stumble into another trap. Once they accept that not everything is their fault, they start thinking about what they should do to fix things. And that word, should, is surprisingly dangerous. Imagine you're here at point A, but you believe you should be at point B. Point B represents where you think you ought to be socially connected, professionally successful, romantically fulfilled. The gap between A and B feels enormous, and every time you take a step forward, all you can see is how far you still have to go. Progress doesn't feel like progress. It feels like evidence of how far behind you are. This is the tyranny of potential, of comparison, of the imagined life you should be living. A student who scores 90, 3 out of 100 on a test, and receives only criticism for the 7 points lost rather than acknowledgement for the 90, 3 points earned. When you focus on what you should accomplish rather than what you can accomplish, even genuine progress becomes a source of pain rather than motivation. There's a different question to ask, a simpler one that changes everything. What can I do today? Not what should you do. Not what you would do if you were different, better, more capable. Not what someone else might do in your position. Just what can you actually do right now? Today, given who you are and where you are, this might sound like lowering the bar, like accepting defeat. It's actually the opposite. It's the difference between setting yourself up for constant failure and setting yourself up for actual, measurable progress. Think about how physical therapists work with someone who's had a stroke and lost the ability to walk. They don't say, you should be able to walk, so let's focus on how far you are from walking. They say, can you wiggle your toes? Good. Can you flex your ankle? Can you lift your leg an inch? Perfect. They work with what's actually there, building incrementally from reality rather than from an imagined should-be state. This approach works because it's based on what's actually possible rather than what seems like it ought to be possible. Every day, the question is simple: what can this person do today? And whatever that is becomes the foundation for tomorrow. The same principle applies to social connection and building a life. If you're isolated and struggling, the question isn't, how can I suddenly become socially successful? The question is, what can I actually do today? Maybe you can't go to a social gathering without crippling anxiety. That's fine. Can you send a message to someone you used to know? Can you respond to something in a group chat? Can you post a comment online in a community you're interested in? Can you make eye contact with a cashier and say thank you? The specific action doesn't matter as much as the principle do something within your actual capacity, not within your imagined should be capacity. Because here's what happens when you approach it this way. The same action can be either a success or a failure, depending on your framework. A brief message to an old acquaintance is a failure if your goal is to have a robust social network with dozens of close friends. It's a success if your goal is to do one thing today that moves toward connection. Same action, completely different emotional outcome. This isn't just about feeling better, though that matters. It's about creating sustainable progress. When your actions lead to success experiences, even small ones, you build momentum. When your actions constantly highlight your perceived failures, you build nothing but discouragement. The mind will resist this approach. It will generate judgments. This is pathetic. This is too slow. This won't be enough. Everyone else is so far ahead. Let those thoughts come. And then return to the simple question, what can I do today? This is what ancient wisdom traditions mean by living in the present. It's not about ignoring the future or pretending the past doesn't matter. Recognizing that the only moment you have any power in is this one, right now. The future is constructed through a series of present moments. If each present moment is spent agonizing over the gap between where you are and where you should be, you're using your energy on something you can't change. If each present moment is spent on actions within your actual capacity, you're building something real. People worry that this approach is too slow, that it will take forever to catch up. But consider the alternative, spending years oscillating between ambitious plans you can't execute and self-recrimination for failing to execute them. That approach doesn't just feel bad, it also doesn't work. The slow, steady approach might seem frustratingly gradual, but it actually produces results because it's based on reality rather than fantasy. And here's something important to understand about that gradual progress. It's not just about action. You can do today might not be a behavior at all. It might be learning something or seeking support, processing emotions that have accumulated over time. This last point deserves special attention because it's easy to overlook. Every negative social experience creates emotional residue. If you go to a gathering and feel awkward, and then you go home and distract yourself with screens without ever processing that discomfort, that emotional residue doesn't disappear. It waits for you. And the next time you're in a similar situation, up it comes, your brain recognizing the environment and saying, hey, remember how this felt terrible last time? Here are all those feelings again. This is the same mechanism that creates lasting trauma. An experience happens, the emotions aren't processed, and those emotions get triggered every time you encounter similar circumstances. Over time, you're not just dealing with the present situation, you're dealing with an accumulated backlog of unprocessed emotional experiences from every similar situation you've ever had. This is why some people feel overwhelmed by social situations. It's not just the current interaction that's causing anxiety, it's the current interaction plus the echo of every previous uncomfortable interaction they never fully processed. The emotional weight becomes crushing not because they're weak, but because they're carrying years of undigested experience. If you're in this situation, part of what you can do today might be creating space to process those emotions rather than immediately jumping into new social challenges. Mean talking with someone trained to help with that processing, or it might mean practices like writing, reflection, or meditation that allow emotions to surface and move through rather than staying stuck. There's also the possibility that what's happening isn't just accumulated stress, but an actual clinical condition that requires professional attention. Social anxiety disorder is real, and it's not the same as being shy or introverted or socially inexperienced. Has a diagnosable condition. That condition needs treatment, and treatment doesn't just mean talking about feelings. It means interventions that actually change how the brain and body respond to social situations. But here's something crucial that often gets missed even after successful treatment for something like social anxiety. There's still a gap that needs addressing. If you've lived with significant social anxiety throughout your developmental years, you've missed out on thousands of hours of normal social practice. Treatment might remove the anxiety, doesn't automatically give you the skills you didn't develop. This is where rehabilitation comes in. Not just treating the condition, but actively building the skills that the condition prevented you from developing naturally. Think of it like someone who had a physical injury that prevented them from learning to walk normally as a child. Healing the injury is crucial, but once healed, they still need physical therapy to develop strength and coordination they missed during the injury period. The same applies to social and psychological development. This is why the question, "What can I do today?" might have different answers at different stages. Early on, the answer might be seek evaluation for whether there's an underlying condition that needs treatment. Later, practice a specific social skill in a low-stakes environment. Still later, B, have a conversation with someone new. The specifics evolve, but the principle remains with what's actually available to you right now. Now, let's address a question that comes up frequently. What if you do take action and nothing happens? What if you reach out to an old friend and they never respond? What if you try to start a conversation and it goes nowhere? This is where the distinction between responsibility and control becomes absolutely critical. You're responsible for your actions. You're not responsible for how others respond to your actions. These are completely separate things, and confusing them will destroy your progress. If you send a message to someone and they don't respond, that tells you nothing about your worth as a person. It might tell you something about them. They're busy. They didn't see it. They're not interested in reconnecting. It might tell you something about your approach. Maybe there's a more effective way to reach out. Doesn't tell you that you're fundamentally flawed or that your efforts are worthless. The trap is thinking that the outcome of your action determines the value of the action itself. But the value of the action is in taking it, in doing what you can do, in moving toward your goals even when the outcome is uncertain. If you study intensely for a test and still fail, doesn't mean the studying was worthless. It means you studied for the wrong material or the test was unusually difficult. There's a learning challenge that needs addressing. The effort itself still mattered. When you reach out to people and some don't respond, the answer isn't to conclude you're worthless. The answer is to reach out to more people or to try different approaches where to examine whether there's something in your approach that could be adjusted. This is learning, not failing. Here's something worth considering when you're working on building social connections. From a place of isolation, you need to cast a wide net. Not everyone will respond, and that's normal. People have their own lives, their own concerns, their own reasons for being available or not. Some will be receptive, others won't, and it often has nothing to do with your inherent value. This brings us to another common concern. What if you feel like you have nothing to say? If conversations feel impossible because you can't think of anything to contribute, here's a secret. You don't need to have something to say to have a conversation. Conversations aren't performances where you're expected to deliver interesting content. They're exchanges where both people participate in exploring a topic together. Think about how interviews work, not the stiff, formal kind, genuine conversations. Does the interviewer spend most of the time sharing their own insights and knowledge? Not usually. They ask questions. They listen. They express curiosity. They say things like, "Can you tell me more about that?" Or, "I don't understand that part. Can you explain?" Or, "That's interesting. Made you think of it that way?" You can have an entire conversation about a topic you know nothing about simply by being genuinely interested and asking questions. In fact, the best conversations happen this way because your lack of knowledge means you ask the questions that draw out the other person's thoughts and experiences. This is actually how connection forms. Not through impressive displays of knowledge or wit, through the simple act of paying attention to another person and giving them space to express themselves. Someone feels heard and understood, that creates a bond. When you're focused on trying to come up with something impressive to say, you're not really present with the other person anyway. So if you feel like you have nothing to say, that's fine. Be someone who listens well and asks genuine questions. That's more than enough. Another question that emerges frequently: is it too late to start building social connections if you're past a certain age? What if you're 31 and everyone around you is in their mid-20s? What if all the social opportunities seem geared toward younger people? The short answer is no. It's not too late. The longer answer is that you might feel out of place, and that feeling is real, but it's not the same as it actually being too late. Feeling out of place because you're slightly older than others in a social setting is uncomfortable. It's not insurmountable. Yes, be life, experience differences. Yes, you might relate differently to certain topics. But if you're attending a concert, for instance, both you and the younger people are there for the same reason, to enjoy the music. If you're in a class, you're all there to learn. The shared purpose creates common ground. The discomfort of being the older person in the room is just that, discomfort. It's not a barrier to connection, it's a feeling to navigate. And feelings, while real and valid, don't determine what's possible. They just determine what's difficult. This is part of being precise about obstacles. The obstacle isn't that you're too old. The obstacle is that you feel uncomfortable about the age difference. And that discomfort might make social interaction more challenging. But challenging isn't the same as impossible. Recognizing the real obstacle, the feeling rather than some objective barrier, helps you address it more effectively. Now we need to talk about something that underlies all of this the accumulated emotional weight that many people carry without realizing it. This is particularly relevant for people who've been isolated for years and find that social situations feel increasingly overwhelming rather than easier with practice. Here's what happens. You go to a social event and feel awkward. Instead of processing that awkwardness, you come home and immediately turn to distraction, screens, games, substances, whatever provides relief. Awkward feeling gets pushed down but not resolved. It's still there, waiting. Next time you go to a similar event, your brain recognizes the environment. It pulls up the old, unprocessed feelings and dumps them into your current experience. Now you're not just dealing with present moment nervousness, you're dealing with that plus the residue from last time. If this pattern repeats for years, you're carrying an enormous backlog of unprocessed emotional experience. This is why the anxiety can feel so disproportionate. It's not that you're overreacting to the current situation. It's that you're responding to the current situation plus dozens or hundreds of previous situations that your mind has linked together. Your nervous system is doing what it's designed to do: pattern recognition and threat response. It's just working with incomplete data because you never fully processed and resolved the previous experiences. Breaking this cycle requires creating time and space to work through that backlog. This might mean professional help like therapy or coaching, mean regular practices that allow emotions to surface and be processed. Writing, meditation, long walks, conversations with trusted people. The specific method matters less than the consistency. And it's worth being honest about the difference between various types of support. Therapy is generally designed to provide space for emotional processing and healing. Coaching is typically focused on skill building and behavioral change. Both can be valuable, but they serve different primary purposes. If you're carrying years of unprocessed emotion, therapy or some other form of emotional work is probably necessary before coaching will be maximally effective. That said, the practical reality is that many people need both space to process accumulated emotions and guidance in building skills they never developed. The order and combination depend on individual circumstances. There's also a specific point about clinical conditions that deserves emphasis. If you have something like social anxiety disorder, a diagnosable condition rather than just shyness or lack of experience, that condition needs direct treatment. Treatment doesn't mean you're broken. It means there's a specific pattern of brain and body response that can be changed with appropriate intervention. Getting treatment for a clinical condition doesn't automatically solve everything. If you've had social anxiety disorder throughout your teenage and young adult years, you've missed critical periods of social development. Even after successful treatment, there's still a process of learning and practicing skills that others developed naturally during the years you were avoiding social situations. This is the rehabilitation aspect that often gets overlooked. In physical medicine, we understand this naturally. Who's had a limb immobilized for months doesn't expect to immediately have full strength and coordination once the cast comes off. They expect to need physical therapy to rebuild what atrophied during immobilization. The same principle applies to social and psychological development, but it's less widely recognized. People sometimes expect that treating the anxiety or depression or other condition should be sufficient, and they're frustrated when they still struggle with practical skills after the symptoms improve. This is a normal part of recovery. First, addressing the condition that prevented development, then doing the developmental work that was missed. This brings us to a broader point about parenting and how these patterns develop in the first place. There's a common temptation to blame parents, but that's usually both unfair and unproductive. Most parents are doing their best with the knowledge and resources they have. If they're not explicitly teaching social skills, it's usually not because they're neglectful or uncaring. It's because they learned those skills through immersion in stable communities. Doesn't occur to them that explicit teaching is necessary, operating from the assumption that their children will learn the same way they did. Through environmental exposure, the environment has changed. The stable, geographically rooted communities that provided automatic social training are increasingly rare. People move frequently. Communities are virtual rather than physical. The old transmission methods don't work anymore, but many parents don't realize that because the change happened gradually within their own lifetimes. Additionally, parenting is influenced by the children themselves in ways that often go unrecognized. Research shows that having a child with certain conditions affects parental stress, depression, and parenting style. It's not that the parents are inadequate. It's that parenting a child who responds differently to typical approaches requires different strategies, and those strategies aren't always obvious. For example, a child with attention difficulties might respond to standard parenting approaches in unexpected ways, which increases parental stress and might lead to less effective interactions, which further complicates the child's development. This creates a cycle that isn't anyone's fault, but affects everyone involved. Understanding this dynamic is important because it helps dissolve the blame that people often carry. Yes, parents might have missed teaching certain skills. No, that doesn't make them bad parents. It makes them people navigating a rapidly changing world without a guidebook. And understanding that frees you from the burden of resentment while allowing you to take responsibility for learning what wasn't taught. This is actually a perfect example of the distinction we discussed earlier, separating what you're responsible for from what you're not. You're not responsible for what you weren't taught. You are responsible for learning it. Now, that's not a burden. It's actually an empowering realization because it clarifies where your agency lies. Let's talk about something that sounds obvious, but operates in subtle ways, the difference between commitment and daily action. People often say that change requires commitment, dedication, sustained effort over time. That's true in a sense, also be misleading because commitment is a future-oriented concept. When you commit to something, you're making a promise about tomorrow and next week and next month. That's a heavy psychological weight. The alternative is simpler, just focus on today, not committing to a month of daily action, just asking what you can do today. Tomorrow you'll ask again, and the day after that, but you never have to carry the weight of committing to an indefinite future. You just have to handle today. This might seem like a semantic distinction, but it's psychologically significant. The commitment framework creates pressure and opportunities for failure. Committed to this, and I'm already falling short. That thought is demotivating and often leads to giving up entirely. Daily action framework is simpler. What can I do today? Okay, I did that. Tomorrow I'll ask again. There's no failure in the daily action framework because you're not measuring yourself against a long-term commitment. You're just taking appropriate action for today, whatever that looks like given your current circumstances and capacity. This relates to an important truth about motivation and behavior change. We tend to overestimate what we can accomplish in the short term and underestimate what we can accomplish through consistent small actions over time. Commitment framework sets us up to overestimate. I'll commit to this dramatic change and then fail. The daily action framework aligns with how change actually happens: small, repeated actions that compound over time. A person who's been isolated for years won't transform into a social butterfly through commitment. They might transform through doing one small thing each day: a message sent, a question asked, brief interaction navigated, and waking up months or years later to discover they've built something real. Now let's address the practical question of how to actually practice social skills when you feel like you lack them. This is where the modern world, despite creating many of these problems, also offers some solutions. One advantage of digital communication is that it can serve as a lower stakes training ground for social interaction. This isn't a replacement for in-person connection. Face-to-face interaction involves body language, tone, timing, and other elements that digital communication lacks. Digital spaces can provide opportunities to practice basic conversational skills without some of the overwhelming aspects of physical presence. Think of it as similar to practicing a language. You might start by texting with someone in that language, gives you time to think and look up words. That's not the same as having a fluent conversation in real time, builds vocabulary and confidence. Later, you move to voice calls, then video, then in-person conversation. Each step builds on the previous one. The key is recognizing that digital interaction is a stepping stone, not a destination. If you can't handle in-person social situations right now, that's okay. Start with what you can handle. Online communities, text conversations, voice chats. Practice the basic rhythms of interaction, asking questions, responding to others, sharing appropriate amounts of information, navigating disagreements. But be aware of a specific phenomenon. The more you rely exclusively on digital communication, the more anxious in-person interaction becomes. This happens because parts of your brain that interpret body language and nonverbal cues need practice to function well. You spend months or years primarily communicating digitally, those parts of your brain atrophy from disuse. Then when you do enter in-person situations, you lack the automatic reassurance that comes from accurately reading social cues, which increases anxiety. This creates a problematic cycle. Digital communication feels easier, so you do it more, which makes in-person interaction feel, which makes you avoid it more, which further weakens your ability to navigate it. Breaking this cycle requires deliberately choosing in-person interaction even when it's uncomfortable, not all at once, but incrementally as part of what you can do today. Some people have created structured ways to practice social skills, combining the advantages of a supportive environment with the goal of real-world application. These function like training grounds where you can try things, get feedback, and improve with guidance rather than trying to figure everything out through trial and error. Value of guided practice versus self-directed learning is significant. Yes, You can eventually figure out how to swim by jumping in the water repeatedly. You can learn much faster with instruction, someone showing you techniques, correcting your form, giving you specific things to practice. The same applies to social skills, job skills, any complex human ability. This is why rehabilitation programs exist for various life skills. If someone has been out of the workforce for years due to mental health challenges, treating the mental health condition doesn't automatically give them the habits and skills needed for employment. They might need a structured program where they practice showing up on time, completing assigned tasks, interacting professionally with colleagues. This isn't demeaning or infantilizing. It's recognizing that skills develop through practice. And if circumstances prevented that practice from happening during typical developmental windows, it needs to happen later with appropriate support. When considering what you can do today, remember that learning and seeking support are valid actions. You don't have to immediately jump into the most challenging situations. Building knowledge, finding helpful resources, connecting with support systems, these are legitimate steps that create the foundation for later behavioral changes. There's a question worth considering carefully. What about situations where you feel like you genuinely have nothing valuable to contribute to a conversation? This feeling is common among people who've been isolated, and it can become a major barrier to reaching out or engaging with others. The truth is that having nothing to say is rarely the real problem. The problem is usually anxiety about whether what you might say is good enough, interesting enough, valuable enough. This is the judgment piece we discussed earlier. The mind generating standards that are impossible to meet, then using failure to meet those standards as justification for not trying. But consider how actual conversations work when they work well. They're not performances where each person delivers polished monologues. They're explorations where people think out loud together, ask questions, express confusion, seek clarity, share reactions, build on each other's ideas. In a good conversation about a topic you know nothing about, you might say things like, "I don't really understand that. Can you explain what you mean? That's interesting. Got you thinking about this? I've never heard of that before. Where did you first encounter it? How do you know that? Did you read it somewhere or experience it directly? That seems contradictory to me. How do those two things fit together?" None of those contributions require expertise. They just require genuine interest and willingness to engage. And often, these questions lead to much better conversations than situations where everyone is trying to showcase their knowledge. There's also value in sharing your own lack of knowledge or experience. "I've never been in that situation. It sounds challenging. How did you handle it?" That's not a weak conversation contribution. It's an invitation for the other person to share more while also being honest about your own position. The fear of having nothing to say often masks a deeper fear that you're not interesting, that others won't want to talk to you. You'll be revealed as boring or awkward. But these are predictions about the future, not facts about the present, based on the assumption that conversation requires you to be impressive, which is fundamentally misunderstanding what conversation is for. Conversation isn't a performance, it's connection. And connection happens through attention, curiosity, and presence, not through impressive displays of knowledge or wit. Let's address a particularly painful aspect of this experience: the feeling that you're too far behind, that everyone else has moved on. You've missed your window for developing normal social connections. This feeling is understandable, but it's based on a comparison that isn't actually useful. Yes, other people your age might have more developed social networks, more relationship experience, more confidence in social situations. That's true. The relevant question isn't, am I as far along as others? The relevant question is, am I making progress from where I am? The person who starts learning a language at 40 will probably never have the native speaker fluency of someone who learned it in childhood. Does that mean they shouldn't bother learning? Of course not. They can still achieve real competence and find tremendous value in the learning process. Similarly, starting to develop social skills at 20, 5 or 30 or 40 means you're starting from a different position than someone who developed them earlier. You might always feel slightly like you're catching up, but you can still build genuine connections, develop real friendships, create meaningful relationships. The outcome won't be identical to what you might have had if you'd started earlier, but it can still be valuable and fulfilling. The comparison trap is especially insidious because it makes progress feel like failure. If your reference point is where you think you should be, every step forward just highlights the remaining distance. If your reference point is where you were yesterday, every step forward is progress. This is why the daily action framework matters so much. When you ask, what can I do today? You're inherently measuring against your current position, not against some idealized should-be position. That makes success achievable and recognizable. There's also something important to understand about the feeling of being out of place in social situations. That feeling is data, but it's not necessarily accurate data. If you're 31 and socializing primarily with people in their mid-20s, you might feel old and out of place. That feeling is real. You're genuinely experiencing it. It's not necessarily reflecting an accurate assessment of the situation. The 25-year-olds might not care about the age difference at all. They might actually appreciate the slightly different perspective you bring, or maybe they do notice, and it does matter to them, not as much as your mind is telling you it matters. The feeling of being out of place is often much more intense internally than the actual external reality warrants. This is especially true for people who've been isolated. They tend to be hypervigilant to any sign of difference or separation. Hypervigilance creates or amplifies the feeling of not belonging. This doesn't mean the feeling isn't real or shouldn't be acknowledged. It means the feeling is information about your internal state, not necessarily accurate information about external reality. The response isn't to dismiss the feeling, but also not to accept it as objective truth about whether you belong or not. The way forward is to acknowledge the feeling. Yes, I feel out of place right now, while continuing to engage with the situation. Feelings don't have to determine actions. You can feel uncomfortable and still continue participate. You can feel out of place and still show up. The feeling might even decrease over time as you get used to the situation, but even if it doesn't have to stop you. This connects to a broader principle about emotional navigation. Feelings are valid and important, but they're not commands. Anxiety tells you something feels threatening, but it doesn't tell you that the threat is real or that you must avoid it. Discomfort tells you something is challenging, but it doesn't tell you that you can't handle it. Loneliness tells you something is missing, but it doesn't tell you that the missing thing is unattainable. Learning to hear feelings without being controlled by them is a crucial skill for anyone navigating social challenges. It means developing a different relationship with your inner experience, one where emotions inform you without dictating to you. Now we need to talk about a challenge that comes up once you start taking action. What happens when your actions don't produce the results you hoped for? You reach out to someone and they don't respond. You try to join a conversation and it fizzles. You attend a social event and come away feeling more lonely than before. These experiences are discouraging, and they're often interpreted as evidence that you were right to be pessimistic, that you're fundamentally unable to connect, that you should give up. This interpretation confuses outcome with effort and confuses a single data point with a pattern. One person not responding doesn't mean no one will respond. One awkward interaction doesn't mean all interactions will be awkward. One disappointing experience doesn't mean all experiences will be disappointing. This is where the distinction between responsibility and control becomes absolutely crucial. You're responsible for making the attempt. You're not responsible for controlling how others respond. These are separate things. If you send 10 messages and get 2 responses, that's not a 90% failure rate. It's 2 successful connections. Yes, 8 people didn't respond, and that might say something about them, or about your approach, or about random chance. But it doesn't say that you failed. It says you made 10 attempts and 2 worked. The question then becomes, can you learn from what did and didn't work? Is there something about the 2 successful connections that you could apply to future attempts? Is there something about your approach that might be refined? This is learning rather than failing, and it requires a specific mindset shift. Instead of "I tried and it didn't work," which proves I'm hopeless, the internal narrative becomes, "I tried 10 things, 2 worked, 8 didn't. What can I learn from this? What would happen if I tried 10 more things with slight variations based on what I learned?" This is experimental rather than judgmental, curious rather than condemning. And it's the mindset that actually produces results over time. Also, a practical reality that needs acknowledging when you're building social connections from a place of isolation. You need volume. Everyone will be available, interested, or responsive. That's not a reflection on your worth. It's just how social networks function. Some connections spark, others don't, and much of it depends on factors entirely beyond your control. The other person's current life circumstances, their own social needs, timing, random chance. Successful social network building often looks like reaching out to 20 people, having 5 respond, meaningful ongoing contact with 2 of those 5. From the outside, you just see someone who has 2 new friends. From the inside, they made 20 attempts, maintained perspective when 15 didn't work out, and built on the 2 that did. This is why the daily action approach is so important. If you're defining success as reach out to people and have everyone respond enthusiastically, you're setting yourself up for disappointment. If you're defining success as today I reached out to someone, then you succeed regardless of their response. And if you do that consistently, portion of those attempts will eventually lead to real connections. Let's talk about something that often gets overlooked, the role of structured learning versus trial and error in skill development. There's a cultural narrative that suggests people should figure things out on their own. That needing help represents weakness. That struggling is somehow more noble than seeking guidance. This narrative is destructive. Yes, you can eventually learn most things through trial and error, but it's slow, inefficient, and unnecessarily difficult. Spend years stumbling toward competence when structured learning could get you there in months. This applies to social skills just as much as to any other skill. You can spend years trying different approaches to conversation and slowly figuring out what works. Or you can learn from people who've studied social dynamics, get feedback on your specific challenges, practice in supported environments, and accelerate your learning dramatically. There's no nobility in struggling alone when support is available. The goal isn't to prove you can do it without help. The goal is to actually develop the capabilities you're trying to build. If help makes that happen more effectively, then seeking help is the smart choice. This might mean therapy for processing accumulated emotional baggage. It might mean coaching for building specific skills. Mean joining groups specifically designed for social practice. It might mean reading, watching educational content, asking for feedback from friends who are better at this than you are. The specific form of support matters less than the willingness to seek it. Seeking support isn't admitting defeat. It's recognizing that learning complex skills goes faster with guidance. There's an interesting paradox in all of this. The people who struggle most with social connection are often the ones who most resist seeking help for it. They see it as further evidence of their inadequacy. I can't even make friends without help. I'm such a failure. When actually, seeking help is evidence of wisdom and self-awareness. If you wanted to learn a musical instrument, you wouldn't think it was shameful to take lessons. If you wanted to learn a language, you wouldn't think it was pathetic to enroll in a class. Social skills are learnable skills like any others. Some people absorbed them automatically through their environment. Others need more explicit instruction. Neither path is better or worse. They're just different routes to the same destination. Now let's address something that comes up frequently in discussions about social isolation, the feeling that even if you could build connections, you've been alone so long that you don't know if you'd actually enjoy socializing anymore. This is a complicated feeling because it might be partly true. If you've been isolated for years, you've likely adapted to that isolation. You've built a life that functions without extensive social contact. You've developed interests and habits that are solitary. Idea of disrupting all that to pursue social connection might genuinely feel unappealing, not just scary. This deserves honest examination. Are you avoiding social connection because of fear and lack of skill, or because you genuinely prefer solitude? These are different situations requiring different responses. For some people, isolation is genuinely a choice rather than a circumstance. They've examined their options, considered what they value, and concluded that solitude serves them better than socialization would. If that's a genuine, examined choice made from a position of capability rather than fear, it's valid. For most people who identify with the patterns we've been discussing, Isolation isn't a genuine choice. It's a response to barriers they don't know how to overcome. Preference for solitude developed as an adaptation to feeling incapable of managing social connection, not from examining both the options and choosing. The way to tell the difference is to ask, if social connection were easy and natural for me, I still prefer to be alone most of the time. If the answer is no, if you'd actually enjoy relationships if they didn't feel so difficult, then the preference for solitude is an adaptation to circumstances rather than a genuine choice. Adaptation is understandable and not something to judge yourself for. When something is painful and difficult, avoiding it makes sense. But it means the path forward involves addressing the barriers rather than accepting isolation as unchangeable. There's also a middle ground worth considering. Maybe you don't want or need an extensive social network. Maybe you're not trying to become extremely extroverted or socially busy. Maybe you just want a few genuine connections or the confidence to handle social situations when they're necessary, or the basic skills to maintain important relationships. That's completely valid, and it's worth being clear about your actual goals rather than assuming you have to become someone you're not. The daily action framework works regardless of whether your goal is having two close friends or having an active social calendar. The question is still, what can I do today to move toward the level of connection that I actually want? Let's talk about something that affects everyone working on personal development, but especially impacts people dealing with isolation and social challenges. Voice of judgment and criticism in your own mind. This voice, sometimes called the inner critic, times just recognized as negative self-talk, generates constant commentary about your inadequacy, your failures, your hopelessness. For people struggling with isolation, this voice is relentless. You're pathetic. Everyone else figured this out years ago. It's too late for you. You're fundamentally broken. Nobody wants to be around you. This voice feels true, and it feels like it's protecting you somehow, maybe by preventing you from trying and failing, maybe by preparing you for rejection, maybe by maintaining some kind of control through anticipating the worst. But this voice isn't truth, and it isn't protection. It's a pattern of thought that developed for complex reasons, maybe learned from how others spoke to you, maybe developed as a response to repeated disappointment, maybe just a habit of mind that strengthened over time. The crucial understanding is that you don't have to believe or obey this voice. You can hear it and recognize it as a thought pattern rather than as truth. This doesn't mean arguing with the voice or trying to suppress it. You try to argue? No, I'm not pathetic. You're still engaging with its premise, taking it seriously as something that might be true or false. The more effective approach is to recognize it as a pattern. There's that critical voice again. That's familiar, and I'm going to do what I'm capable of doing today anyway. The voice will probably continue. That's fine. Let it say what it says. You can acknowledge its presence without giving it control over your actions. This is part of what meditation and mindfulness practices actually do, though they're often misunderstood. They're not about achieving some blissful state where negative thoughts disappear. They're about developing a different relationship with thoughts, seeing them as mental events rather than as unquestionable truths. You can hear the voice saying, "You're pathetic for only being able to send one message today," and respond internally with That's the judging voice, and I'm going to acknowledge that I did what I could do today anyway. You've made a significant shift. You're no longer being controlled by that internal narrative. This skill develops with practice, just like any other skill. At first, the critical voice might completely dominate your internal experience. With practice, you start noticing it. With more practice, you start recognizing it as a pattern rather than as truth. Eventually, you might even develop some compassion for why that voice developed and what it was trying to do, even as you stop letting it determine your actions. All of this ties back to the core principle. What can you do today? The critical voice will always have opinions about whether what you can do today is enough. Let it have those opinions. Do what you can do anyway. Now, we need to address something that might seem like a tangent, but is actually central: the role of clinical conditions and professional treatment. Everything we've discussed applies to people who struggle with social connection due to lack of skill, unfavorable circumstances, accumulated negative experiences, and systemic changes in how society functions. Some people struggle because they have diagnosable conditions: social anxiety disorder, depression, autism spectrum conditions, attention difficulties, and many others that fundamentally alter how they experience and navigate social situations. If you have a clinical condition, self-help approaches aren't enough. They might be part of the solution, but they're not a substitute for appropriate professional treatment. The challenge is that many people don't know whether they have a diagnosable condition. They assume they're just bad at socializing, or awkward, or introverted, when actually there's a specific condition that could be identified and treated. If you've been struggling with social isolation, significant anxiety in social situations, or persistent difficulty connecting with others despite trying, it's worth getting a professional evaluation. This doesn't mean you're broken or defective. It means you're being thorough about understanding what's happening and what might help. Conditions respond well to medication. Others respond to specific types of therapy. Some need a combination, but you can't access appropriate treatment until you know what you're dealing with. There's also a specific point about conditions that affect social functioning even after successful treatment. There's usually still work to do. If you've had social anxiety throughout your developmental years, treating the anxiety doesn't automatically give you the social skills and experiences you missed while the anxiety was preventing your participation. This is where the concept of psychological rehabilitation becomes important. Just as physical rehabilitation helps someone rebuild strength and coordination after an injury, logical rehabilitation helps rebuild skills and habits that were prevented from developing normally by mental health challenges. Unfortunately, this rehabilitation aspect is often overlooked. People get treatment for the condition, the acute symptoms improve, they're surprised that they still struggle with practical social functioning. But this makes complete sense. The condition prevented development of certain capabilities, and treating the condition doesn't automatically create those capabilities. They still need to be built. This is where professional support, structured practice, and the daily action approach all come together. You address the clinical condition. You process accumulated emotional baggage. You learn skills you missed. You practice in progressively challenging situations. You build on small successes. You maintain perspective about setbacks. It's a process, not a switch that flips. And recognizing it as a process helps maintain realistic expectations while still working toward genuine change. Let's come back to something fundamental that we touched on earlier, but deserves deeper exploration. The concept of circumstances beyond your control and why understanding this is liberating rather than limiting. You didn't choose when you were born. That timing determined what technological and social environment you grew up in. You didn't choose your parents, which determined what explicit teaching and modeling you received around social skills and relationship maintenance. You didn't choose your neighborhood, school, or childhood community, which determined what automatic social training you were exposed to. You didn't choose your neurological makeup, which determines how easily you naturally pick up on social cues and navigate interpersonal dynamics. All of these factors, none of which you controlled, contributed to where you are now. That's not an excuse or a cop-out. It's just reality. When people hear this, they sometimes worry that acknowledging circumstances means absolving yourself of responsibility. But actually, understanding circumstances clearly is what allows you to take appropriate responsibility. If you think everything is your fault, you end up trying to take responsibility for things you can't actually control, other people's responses, historical patterns, systemic factors. That's exhausting and impossible, and it sets you up for constant failure. If you understand what you actually control, your own actions in the present moment, then you can direct your energy effectively. You stop wasting time trying to change your past or fix systemic problems or control other people's behavior. You focus on what you can actually do. This is why the perspective on circumstances isn't about blame or excuses. It's about clarity. Once you're clear about what's in your control and what isn't, you can actually make progress instead of spinning your wheels trying to fix things that aren't yours to fix. There's also something important about self-compassion here. When you understand that you're navigating challenges that weren't entirely of your own making, you can approach yourself with more kindness. Not because you're giving yourself a pass on taking action, but because you're recognizing that you're doing your best with what you have. This matters because the self-judgment and self-criticism we discussed earlier consume enormous amounts of energy. When you can approach yourself with more compassion, this is challenging, and I'm working on it. It's okay that it's hard. You free up that energy for actual progress. Self-compassion isn't self-pity or self-indulgence. It's treating yourself the way you'd treat a friend who was struggling with similar challenges, with support and encouragement rather than harsh judgment. It's recognizing that beating yourself up doesn't actually help you improve. It just makes the journey more painful. This brings us to a final point about sustainable change versus dramatic transformation. There's a temptation, especially when you're deeply dissatisfied with your current situation, to want dramatic transformation, to want to become a completely different person with entirely different capabilities, to want everything to change quickly and completely. That desire is understandable but problematic. Dramatic transformations happen occasionally, usually in response to dramatic circumstances. Sustainable, lasting change almost always happens through small, repeated actions over time. The person who's isolated at 25 probably won't become socially thriving by 26. They might have 2 or 3 genuine friendships by 27. A small but meaningful social network by 30. Comfort and confidence in social situations by 35. And the person who arrives at 35 with those capabilities built through patient, persistent work has something more stable and lasting than someone who tries to force dramatic transformation. This is why the daily action framework matters so much. It's designed for sustainable change rather than dramatic transformation. It's designed to work with human psychology and human capability rather than against it. When you ask, what can I do today? And you do that thing, you're building sustainable momentum. It might not feel dramatic. It might feel frustratingly slow. But it's movement in the right direction, and it compounds over time in ways that dramatic attempts at transformation usually don't. There's also something important about identity here. When you try to transform dramatically, you're essentially trying to become a different person. When you take consistent small actions, you're becoming more of yourself, just a version that has developed capabilities you previously lacked. That might sound like a subtle distinction, but it's psychologically significant. Trying to become a different person creates internal conflict and resistance. Developing capabilities while remaining essentially yourself feels more natural and sustainable. As you consider your own situation, whether you identify with the patterns we've discussed or are supporting someone who does, the path forward becomes clearer. Understand the systemic and circumstantial factors that contributed to where you are. Not to make excuses, but to stop accepting blame for things outside your control. Second, identify what you actually are responsible for, your own actions in the present moment. Release the burden of trying to control outcomes, other people's responses, or circumstances you can't change. Third, ask every day, what can I do today? Not what you should do, not what you'd do if you were different, but what you can actually do given who you are and where you are right now. Fourth, do that thing. However small it seems, however insufficient it feels compared to where you think you should be, do what you can actually do. Fifth, recognize that thing as progress rather than as evidence of inadequacy. You did what you could do today. That's success. Sixth, repeat. Tomorrow, you'll ask again. You'll do what you can do. You'll recognize it as progress. And gradually, consistently, your capacity will expand. This won't happen overnight. It might not even be perceptible week to week. But over months and years, consistent small actions compound into real change. Person who takes one step forward every day for a year is 365 steps ahead of where they started. That's not nothing. And along the way, seek appropriate support, whether that's professional treatment for clinical conditions, coaching for skill development, therapy for processing emotions, or just educational resources that help you understand what you're working on. Support makes the journey faster and more effective. The path from isolation to connection isn't mysterious or impossible. It's just patient, persistent work of developing capabilities that others might have developed automatically, but you need to build deliberately. That's not a moral failing. It's just a fact of your particular circumstances, and facts can be worked with. You're not a lost cause. You're not fundamentally flawed. You're not too far behind to catch up. You're a person who's navigating specific challenges, and those challenges can be addressed through appropriate understanding and consistent effort. The plane didn't take off before. That doesn't mean it can't take off now. It just means you need to understand what prevented takeoff and address it systematically. Understand the systemic factors, process accumulated emotions, learn skills you missed. Practice consistently. Build on small successes. Maintain perspective about setbacks. Get appropriate support. Do what you can do today. Tomorrow, ask again. Keep going. The destination isn't some perfect state of social thriving. It's movement from isolation toward connection, from feeling lost toward finding direction, from helplessness toward capability. That journey is available to you regardless of your age, your history, or how long you've been struggling. It starts with understanding where you actually are, accepting what brought you here without accepting that it defines your future, and taking one small step in the direction you want to go. What can you do today? Whatever that is, it's enough to start. And starting is what matters. The rest is just continuation, asking the same question tomorrow, taking the next small step, building momentum one day at a time until you look back and realize you've traveled further than you thought possible